ineffective classroom instruction, reading comprehension, reduced reading experience, vocabulary and background knowledge. These are all certainly important when we consider our own effectiveness in the classroom to be teachers. What are we going to do with students who have dyslexia? If we know that it's neurological in nature, if we know that it's characterized by word recognition, poor word recognition, poor spelling and decoding abilities, these are all things that we can look at when we're starting to think about what is dyslexia and how do I know if a student has it? And furthermore, what am I going to do in my classroom to help students that have dyslexia? What dyslexia is not. It is not a vision or hearing issue. This was an old school way of thinking, and you will still hear people referring to dyslexia as that. But our research now, we currently know that it is not a vision or a hearing issue. It is not about seeing words or letters backwards. So I know this was another attribute that people thought was certainly a red flag for dyslexia, perhaps reversing a B and a D. Actually, we know that this is not necessarily attributable to dyslexia, seeing words and letters backwards. Attributable to limited intelligence. In fact, this is quite the opposite. We know that students who have dyslexia are actually very high with intelligence and have high IQs and tend to do very well in all other areas of school except for reading. Students also have low motivation or limited effort. This used to be a belief that, the students aren't putting in enough effort or they're not motivated to learn. We also used to believe that it was due to poor teaching. We used to think it was rare. And we used to believe that it was a condition that could be outgrown. None of these things are actually the case. Some pre-reader red flags. So when we think about pre-readers, we're talking about emergent reading, students that are preschool, kindergarten age. Some pre-reader red flags. Students lack an ability to retain alphabetic writing instruction, to retain alphabetic letter knowledge, being able to remember the sounds of letters. Students lack an ability to progress in phonemic awareness instruction. They lack the ability to progress in phonics instruction, and they lack the ability to connect letters and their sound correspondence. So putting the sound to the letter. If I see the symbol or the grapheme B, I know that B makes the B sound. But in students that with dyslexia, this is often a problem, and they are not able to associate the letter and the sound together. And again, this is pre-reader, so you're talking preschool, kindergarten, that age. Reader red flags. Students lack the ability to decode words, to read accurately and fluently, to spell words that have been taught or learned. So you've taught it, you've gone over it in the classroom, and then you're asking them to do it, and they still struggle, even though you spent a lot of instructional time going over it. It's very difficult for them to spell words like this. Also, students lack the ability to express their thoughts in writing, and they understand or comprehend things that they read. This is very difficult. And if you think about this, going back to this passage, you can kind of understand why this was most likely difficult for you to try and understand and comprehend what you were reading. So imagine having to experience this on pretty much a daily basis. Some characteristics in the phonological processing. So students might have delayed speech or early articulation errors. So in other words, they're having difficulties pronouncing words. This is one of the red flags early on. Confusion of similar sounds. So B and P are confused frequently. F and V are confused frequently. Students with dyslexia also display poor rhyming skills, the inability to master segmenting, and difficulties identifying the initial, medial, and final sounds in a word. So if I said, tell me the first sound you hear in cat, k is the answer. But sometimes this is difficult for students with dyslexia. Or perhaps, what is the last sound that you hear in the word cat? T is the answer. But again, this might be difficult for students with dyslexia to try and pinpoint the sound that they're actually hearing. Characteristics of dyslexia in the orthographic processor of students. So what this means is that students with dyslexia will oftentimes have difficulties copying from the board or a book, which unfortunately we seem to ask students to do this quite frequently in the classroom. And I'm sure many of you can remember copying from a book or the board. And students that have dyslexia have a very difficult time with this. We will also learn about how this interacts with dysgraphia next week. Students with dyslexia also have difficulty learning how to make letter forms. So it's very difficult for them to even learn how to make the letters. They have difficulties remembering high frequency words. Those are your Dolch words, your Rebecca Sitton words. They have difficulties remembering those. Students with dyslexia have difficulties and confuse similar looking letters and words. So I'm going to use the example of hearse and horse. They look similar, and oftentimes students will confuse words that look very similar like that. They also have difficulties with the rules of English and spelling. They find these very difficult to master. For example, I before E, except after C, that kind of stuff. Rapid naming red flags. So students with dyslexia often experience difficulties sustaining attention to the process of naming and sounding letter symbols. So if they see the letter B, they might have difficulty pulling out that B makes the B sound. It's very hard for them to produce that sound that coordinates with that symbol or the grapheme. Students with dyslexia have difficulty retrieving verbal labels. They also have difficulties articulating words rapidly. So in other words, sounding words out rapidly and automatically. They have very difficult time doing that. We know throughout the course that the Simple View of Reading by Go and Tunmer in 1986 says that language comprehension is multiplied by decoding to come up with reading comprehension. So reading comprehension is the product of language comprehension and decoding. You cannot have one of these and not the other and still have reading comprehension. Okay, so I'm going to go back. I'm trying not to make you too dizzy here, but let's go back for a minute. Consider this, the passage that I had you take a look at. If you had language comprehension, so you could read this first sentence here. I had never seen dogs fight as these, and then we kind of have difficulties with this, right? So imagine if these words here where the blanks are, if these were filled in, but we could not decode them, we would not be able to comprehend this passage. And so that's why these blanks are here, is to kind of represent our inability to decode these words and in order to make sense of it. So this would be a great example of the language comprehension multiplied by decoding equals reading comprehension. We would not have reading comprehension if this passage, because we were unable to decode. And this is a huge problem for students with dyslexia. Okay. Scarborough's rope says that the strands of the rope represent skilled reading. Our bottom strands, the word recognition, are important for the top strands to be strong. So again, this is very similar to the Simple View of Reading. If you can imagine on the left-hand side, the language comprehension part of this equation, is actually the language comprehension, the top piece of this rope. Okay, and again, going back, the decoding piece of this equation is the word recognition piece, or the bottom part of Scarborough's rope. So in order for the top strands of the rope, or the language comprehension piece, to be strong, we have to ensure that the word recognition part of the rope is strong. And this will happen, and as this happens, automaticity builds, and so does the skill development and comprehension. But we cannot have one part of the rope without the other in order for that rope to be strong, and in order for us to have good reading comprehension and fluent reading. Erie's phases of reading development is another way of looking at this. I would like to show you this too, and you can kind of keep this in mind as you're thinking about the progression of how students learn to read and difficulties of students when they are learning to read, and maybe you're starting to notice some red flags. You can kind of start thinking about this progression of reading development. So first we have the pre-alphabetic stage, and I'm going down from top to bottom. So pre-alphabetic stage, we're looking at environmental print. So what is in the student's environment in the pre-alphabetic stage? They're young, they're preschool age, that kind of thing, beginning kindergarten. They have a general idea for the concepts of print, but if you ask them to write something down, they're just going to scribble, right? Scribble, scrabble. It doesn't really make any sense. The next phase is early alphabetic or partial alphabetic. And this is letter names and some letter sounds. So they're able to read some letter names and some letter sounds. If they see B, because B is in the word in their name, for example, most kids know the letters in their name, or at least what their first name begins with. And so they're beginning to pick these things out, the letter name and the sound that goes with it. They have early phonological awareness skills, syllable, onset rhyme, and initial matching. They also have writing that has at least the initial sound, but it's kind of gibberish afterwards. So maybe they're going to try and write their name, and it begins with a B, like Becky, for example. They might write B because they know how to write B, but then everything else is kind of gibberish. Maybe they're trying to write you a letter, and so they want to say, I love you. So they might write I, and then love, L, and then maybe nothing after that, maybe just gibberish. And so again, at least they have kind of the initial sound, but afterwards it's kind of gibberish and downhill from there. Later, as students progress through the phases of reading development, they fall into the later alphabetic stage. This is where they start to begin sight word recognition. They have basic phonological awareness skills. They can segment 3 and 4 phonemes and blending in words, and they start to write phonetically. So if I said the student was going to write I love you, they might write I-L-V, kind of leave out the vowel, and then maybe they write the letter U for you, or they might even write a Y, and that's it, okay? And then finally, consolidated alphabetic, or sometimes called full alphabetic stage. This shows an increased automaticity with sight words. They're able to pick up more and more sight words as they go along. They're able to do orthographic mapping. So in other words, adding a sound to the print. They are understanding that the words on the page have meaning, and they have sounds that correspond with those letters. And then finally, they're more efficient in word production skills in their reading and in their writing. So let's talk about orthographic mapping. And then I'm going to end this presentation after we get done talking about orthographic mapping, and we will pick up where we left off on the next presentation. So orthographic mapping is, according to Kilpatrick in 2016, the mental process that we use to store words for immediate, effortless retrieval.